I'm told that a crisis developed during the last break that I'd like to address. Apparently, we ran out of coffee. We've sent a student across the street to Starbucks to buy more coffee. So, you know, we're problem solvers here. In that spirit, you can't really have a conference like this without having a panel of the state principals. So that's what we're going to do now. We had all 7 state principals for a couple minutes, and then Brandon got ill, and so then he went home. So we will have 6 of 7. And, you know, in the tradition of how this works, things will be assigned to Brandon now that he's not here. So I look forward to seeing how that plays out. But one of the beauties of this panel is that I don't have to do it. I'm going to hand it over to Shannon Mullane, who many of you know is a journalist with the Colorado Sun. I'm a big fan of Shannon's. For so many years, there just wasn't a lot of really good journalism about the Colorado River, and that's really changed in the last a couple of years, and Shannon's a big part of it. And so I've asked her if she would take on the heavy lift of running this panel, and she agreed. And so in the spirit of being cooperative, I'll get out of your way. And the panelists for this, the state, you know who you are. Tom, come on down. Tom, come on down. JB, Becky, I see Estevan, Jean, John. That looks like a full house. Do you need anything else from me?
No.
I'll be over here. I'm off the hook. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you today. Thanks, Doug, for the introduction. I might have to differ on one point. I do think I'm following in some great journalistic footsteps in the Colorado River Basin. Okay, yeah. But thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be able to lead this panel discussion today. I know that you're excited to hear what our panelists have to say. I'm sure they're super stoked on this whole adventure that we're about to partake in. But before we dive in, again, I'm Shannon Mullane. I'm the Colorado River reporter for the Colorado Sun. I just want to get the lay of the land. So obviously, the topic of discussion today is the post-2026 negotiations between states to offer ideas on guidance on the future management of the Colorado River Basin. And the current guidelines, established in 2007, are expiring. So we know we have to get new guidelines. They are playing central roles in that process. They've been appointed by their respective states to do so. They also have been tasked with addressing really difficult questions, like how do you stabilize storage in the basin? Obviously, Lakes Mead and Powell are quite low. The 2007 guidelines couldn't prevent them from falling to crisis levels. And so how do you rebuild storage in the basin is another critical question. How do you design systems that can manage the river basin in times of unpredictable climate events? And so there's a lot that they are going to be discussing. Perhaps one of the most contentious issues is who takes water cuts, when and how, and by how much. So we'll talk about that some too. We have an hour of a moderated discussion. There will be a 30 minutes or so for an audience Q&A. Please submit some questions if you don't hear something in the discussion that I don't get to, throw it in the mix, because I already know I'm gonna have to cut some questions out for time. So we'll see how it goes. Okay. You all are facing a limited period of time to do what you need to do. There's a presidential election coming up. Bureau of Reclamation has said that it wants to release its draft EIS with all the alternatives for post-2026 management in December. So if you can I think the first question that I want to dive into, and I'll introduce you as we go, is when you're thinking of the next steps in the negotiations, which broke down earlier this year, which resulted in competing proposals from the upper basin and the lower basin, are you planning, is it realistic at this time to have a 7-state consensus proposal before you would need to turn it into reclamation for its analysis? Or are you planning to wait until the draft EIS comes out and respond to that? We can start with Becky Mitchell, Colorado's Colorado River Commissioner.
So as I'm understanding the question, is it realistic for us to have a 7-state proposal? And I think not only is it realistic, but it's absolutely essential. And I think that is what we're aiming for. When we talk about breakdowns, it is because this is a difficult situation that we are in. And I've often spoken about the fears that we have. And while there is concern over maybe competing proposals, I think there's a lot of similarities and some real opportunities within those two proposals. While there is the fear of those two proposals out there, where there is concern over what the federal government may do, that concern is small in comparison to what Mother Nature is telling us. And so I think we don't have a lot of choices, but the folks that you see up here, plus Brandon, who gave me his proxy. I don't know how he got sick.
He gave it to me.
I don't know what happened, but when you see us sitting up here, this is the options, and I think we're trying. There's a lot at stake. You heard my governor talk about the importance of the Colorado River within the state of Colorado, the lives that matter as it relates to that. We know about all 40 million. There's not a lot of options, but for us to get together, and I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic that we can.
Alrighty. We have John Insminger, the General Manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. What are your thoughts?
Well, first my thought is I did not know that faking getting sick was an option.
Just eat this, John.
Yeah, I would have been happy to get Becky my proxy too.
It's not too late.
Yeah.
Just give me your proxy.
I think it's important to understand where we are in the process, right? I mean, we need new rules essentially for how to operate the plumbing on the Colorado River by the end of 2026. So when people talk about, we missed deadlines or we're at an impasse, we're 30 months out. We're very much in the second or third inning of this baseball game that we're playing here. And while I think the DEIS is an essential part of the process, that's going to establish, sort of the boundaries of the possible solutions, you also don't have any real idea what's going to be done with that DEIS in the next administration, whether that's Republican or Democrat. So I don't think we should get too wrapped up around, the upper basin has an alternative, the lower basin has an alternative. I think it's more essential to focus on the fact that the folks up here, the folks in this room, we want to keep our hands on the steering wheel. And whatever the rules of the road are come January 1, 2027, we want to be the ones that have implemented those. Because there's a long way to go before we get there. And while we work on the rules, I think it's really important to focus on what everyone is doing to use less water. Because, we can argue all day about a PAL to me release curve. We can argue all day about what triggers lower basin shortages, but none of that's going to matter if we're not comporting our water usage across 7 states and 2 countries to the amount of water that is actually available. So while we work on these negotiations, focusing at the water user level of everyone contributing to the greater good and using less water is really the main event of what's going on the Colorado River.
Okay, thank you. We have Esteban Lopez, New Mexico Upper Colorado River Compact Commissioner and Governor's Representative on the Colorado River. As we go, I'm also curious about this question of what's realistic in terms of just the literal time that's available. But yeah, what do you think is realistic? Is it doing it before the draft comes out or seeing what Reclamation comes up with?
First of all, I think I agree with both Becky and John in how they answered this. One, it's essential that we keep working towards a consensus amongst us. And it's not going to be, that's not going to be easy to achieve by any stretch. We haven't, as Becky noted, I wouldn't call it a breakdown, but I do think that there was kind of a hiatus, and it's indicative of just how difficult these issues are, and how passionate people are about protecting their state's interests. But you know, I'd hearken back to what happened with the most recent SEIS. You know, we started out with 2 different alternatives that Reclamation was analyzing. They issued a draft EIS or SEIS, and at that point, there was a shift in some of the thinking, and there was adequate time to do what needed to be done to get a final SEIS and a record of decision just recently. That, as noted by Commissioner Tootin, I think stabilized the system. We have, you know, I guess in an ideal world, we would have come together and gotten to a consensus immediately, and been working on that, you know, Reclamation, and everybody would have been singing Kumbaya and working on this already. But it's not an ideal world, and it's a really difficult problem. So I think what you have from us is a commitment to keep working on it, and we'll work on it for as long as it takes.
Thank you. Next is Jean Shawcroft, Chair of the Colorado River Authority of Utah. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Shannon. Some of you may have seen Brandon this morning, and he was sick, and I'm glad he's not here. As we think about these complex issues that have been well talked about today, I think Commissioner Tootin hit it on the head this morning when she described that we all 7 care very, very deeply about this river. Because we care so deeply, we don't want to mess it up. We want to take the right time, have the right conversations with the right people to make sure that we do something that's beneficial long term. We want to make sure that we don't do things that potentially make it more chaotic or more of a concern. But the challenges that are ahead of us are absolutely enormous. I agree 100% that we are committed to making things happen, making them happen or come up with some thoughts prior to a draft statement. I think that's something that we are committed to do. I agree with Esteban. I don't think there was a breakdown. I wouldn't describe it as that. I would describe it as everyone doing their proper homework before and immediately after the alternatives were submitted. But to your point, are we working? Absolutely. Commissioner Solomon talked about keep talking, and that's what we're doing. And be aware of the issues. It takes time to understand the complexities of other states' concerns. It's hard enough to understand one state's concerns if you live in that state. It's another thing to try to understand and have empathy and an understanding of what's going on in the other 6 states. So yes, we are talking, we are committed, and we'll continue to work together. Thank you.
You're talking, and you have had meetings since March. You guys have you all met together since March in negotiations? Because I had heard that you weren't meeting.
Several times.
Okay, good.
Face-to-face and several virtually.
Cool. Okay, great. Alrighty. So next we have JB Hamby, chairman of the Colorado River Board of California. JB, how realistic is it to reach a 7-state proposal? And maybe elaborate on how those negotiations have moved forward since March.
Sure, absolutely. And I'll sort of widen the frame of time to look at what it's looked like to actually materialize deals in the past. Just last January, where we were, it was a very unpleasant time. You had 6 states versus California at that point in time. There was no real end in sight. The reservoirs were on the brink of collapse. And 4 months later, what materialized was the largest conservation pact ever in the history of the West. Big deal. And now we're here. And so certainly there's been some pauses, or as Commissioner Selmone has stated, sometimes spicy or tense or whatever, thesaurus words we can pull out. But we've also had a great amount of progress. And I want to share just one of those for context here, because Rome really wasn't built in a day. All 7 of us are in consensus about one very important critical thing that's been talked about for many years. And Commissioner Tootin in various times said even just talking about it was a big deal. And that's the structural deficit that's pulled the river down to where it is today and where it's gotten over the last 20 years. So the fact that we have a 7-state consensus to exceed that structural deficit, come up with a plan to reduce by 1.5 million acre-feet a year, not just resolving the structural deficit, but rebuilding storage gradually, that's a huge deal as well. And so as part of that, Arizona and California, 2 states who have a long, interesting history at times, that yes, and lawyers churned out of institutions like this were put to a lot of work on. We've gone beyond that and pulled out the technical folks and other agencies within our respective states to be able to materialize the largest chunk of that 1.5 million acre-feet. That's been a collaborative process. Fits and starts throughout the way. But I think based on just those 2 examples of sometimes contentious conflict, quickly turning around and turning into really productive, exhilarating periods of time is a good thing. So certainly we'll get through different meetings that we'll organize and have lunch or whatever. And ultimately, I feel pretty confident we'll sign something at some place.
Great. Sounds like a plan. There you go.
You need a pen?
All right, last we have Tom Bushotsky, Director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources. Tom, how realistic is it? And can you also share some of how you see the negotiations moving forward in the past few months?
Sure. So first, John talked about being in the 2nd or 3rd inning or so. Going last helps. You can ask Google stuff. Since 1908, there's only been 24 perfect games in baseball, right? We're not on a perfect game, but those are rare, right? So fits and starts are going to occur, right? But I think from the discussions that I've been involved in with these folks to my right, I think we share some really important common themes. A couple of them we heard from the governor. First one, we want to control our own destiny. We don't want judges or Congress to decide the fate for us, our water users, our tribes, and the fate of this river. Second, we don't want litigation. And third, I think we all agree that today we have to live within our means. And the hard part's gonna be figuring out how to put these pieces together. And the last one is recognizing the impacts of the shortages that we've all taken to date and that we're gonna have to take in the future. Those are some really sound principles that I think we all agree to sitting at this table. And so sometimes maybe our human condition leads us to the negative rather than the positive. So I think on the basis of the fact that we have those principles in common, I do think that within the time we have before us, and it may not necessarily have to be when the draft EIS is published, we can get this done.
Okay, thank you. I was going to save this question for later, but it seems like an okay time to talk about it. John, in December, we all had CRUA, Colorado River Water Users Association Conference in Las Vegas. there was a great panel there too. And so in that time, you were talking about the three options that Tom just mentioned, the litigation, legislation, and negotiation. And we heard similar things at the time about people really wanting to go with negotiation. There were risks involved with the other ones. I remember, Becky, you had said you wanted to avoid the Supreme Court, but you could not accept a plan that did not acknowledge the existing shortages in the upper basin that get taken there. So the question at hand is, will you commit today that taking the question before the Supreme Court is off the table? You don't. It's not just a question for you. It is, everyone can pitch in for this.
I don't think the six of us decide that question.
Tell me more.
Because, I mean, look, I work for 12 elected officials, right? If I can negotiate a good enough deal for Nevada to sign on to, which in essence reduces our compact allocation under, 85% of the hydrologic scenarios, then, we'll sign on to that. If this negotiated process fails and the federal government tries to unilaterally impose on Nevada something we believe to be unreasonable, then we reserve our options to defend ourselves.
Anyone else want to chime in? I'm interested in hearing from everyone.
I'm in the same place as John. I work directly for one elected official, but I think you all know that in DCP and in other circumstances, I have to go to 90 legislators as well. So John, can I trade places? You can have 12. I'll take but again, if the record of decision says...
Two days every 120 years, Tom.
Sorry, Arizona, your 2.8 million at least gone under the record of decision. What do you think we're going to do? Say, thank you very much, Commissioner? I don't think that's going to be the outcome. So same as John, we have to assess the outcome, and we reserve the right as well to be there if we have to.
Yes, that's fine.
I think that's the wrong question.
Cool.
We shouldn't be asked to set that aside. That's actually the lever that gets us to move.
Okay.
None of us wants to go there, but that is the lever that we have to get it to make sure that everyone understands what the risk is and stays away from those really risky positions. And I think like the others, that's not a decision that we will make. At the very least, we're going to make a recommendation. And you've heard from all of us already how none of us think that's a good idea. But we have to preserve that lever. That is what will make opportunities for us to adjust course.
And if I could just add on to that, it's always been the lever, right? I mean, we got the 07 guidelines done because Secretary Norton, in May 2005, pointed a gun at us and said, "You do it or I will." Right? We got DCP done because Commissioner Berman, stood up at Caesars and said, "Close isn't done, and if you don't get it done, I will." That the threat of that, either unilateral federal anvil hanging over you or deciding we're no longer the humans that are in charge of making these decisions, we're going to turn it over to humans in black robes to make these decisions. That's always been there and always will be there. So I agree with Esteban that I don't think it's the right question because nobody can guarantee, that that's off the table forever. But our job is to not let it get there.
Jean, I think you seem like you have something to add, and maybe we can also elaborate what those risks look like for folks as we go.
I agree that it is the wrong question. That is not, we're not doing this to avoid that. We're doing this to make the system better, to find a way that we can all rely on the river. One of the things that former commissioner from Wyoming, Pat, told me after he spent many, many years around this table, when I started in this role, I spent some time with him, and asked him what advice he had for me. And part of his advice was no matter what you agree to at the table, you have to take it home and sell it to your people. And if we can't do that, then that, to John's point, it's not our decision where that goes. It's our responsibility to put something together that makes the system better, and I think that's what we're committed to.
JB and Becky?
Litigation is a really bad option. We shouldn't choose it. I look often in one of the libraries, Imperial Irrigation District, and there's a 45-volume set of the transcripts of Arizona versus California. Filed in 1952, court didn't close that until like 2006. Is that what we really want? At least when we have our troubles or spicy periods or whatever, we can hit the reset button and meet again and move on. If we commit to the litigation path, that sounds very exciting for maybe some users throughout the basin. Just one example in the past was California, who actively during that period of time wanted the Congress to, or asked the Congress to go to the Supreme Court and have that be adjudicated by the court until it finally did happen. Turned out very different than what California initially expected. So that would be, I think, a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks litigation is a good option today. Get ready to be totally surprised by whatever the outcome might be, because it's not as certain as some water users might think it is. So that is the absolute last and worst option on the table, and there's a reason we have interim guidelines. We're not trying to define what the permanent future of the river is, but we're incrementally making those fixes. And what we've already conceptually agreed to, making this 1.5 million acre foot a year reduction, makes massive strides in fixing this problem we've seen for a long time, building a buffer against climate change. And if we spend a fraction of the effort you would in a Supreme Court case and actually trying to work something out that makes sense for a certain duration period of time, that works out pretty well.
All right, thank you. Becky?
I agree with all these gentlemen. But I do think that being out there is part of the reason why we're able to sit here. And I think it's important to remember that is that a worst case scenario, that is definitely in the worst case scenario. We have things that we cannot accept. Every single state has that. Every single state has a responsibility to their water users within their state. And so, yes, that is out there, but that is the worst case scenario, and it's why we're able to be here.
Alrighty, well, thank you. Thank you for outlining that. We can kind of continue just the discussion of the negotiations at a high level. I think that's a good way to dive in at a high level, but I want to talk a little bit about these proposals that you all released earlier this year. I want to make sure that we're talking to a lot of experts and a general audience, so let's try and make it as clear as possible. I know y'all could talk about this for hours probably, but can you, and I'm going to give this question to one person to Esteban for the Upper Basin proposal and to John for the Lower Basin proposal. Can you explain how your proposal works at a high level and how it will rebuild storage in the basin? We can start maybe with Esteban.
Thanks for that question. As demonstrated by 2022 in particular, the 2007 guidelines are not robust enough for what we're seeing in hydrology today. And those guidelines were, in essence, they were designed to try and give lower basin users as much assurance as possible as to having a steady supply of water. And what it ended up doing was, in essence, it drained both Meade and Powell because of the way that was set up. And so the upper division alternative, we strive to pivot to a supply-based operation where uses are reduced to the amount of water that's available. You've heard it said here by virtually everybody here, I think, that we've got to live within our means. That's the basis of our proposal. There's a few principles that we tried to adhere to in setting this up. One, we wanted to assure that it was consistent with the law of the river as we understand it. And we understand that there's a lot of different perspectives as to exactly what the law of the river is, and probably a lot of different interpretations about that as well. But we also wanted to reduce the risk of depleting supplies in both Lakes Mead and Powell. We want to make use of the best available science. We know more today about what to expect from climate change than we did in 2007, way more. And but we still don't know. We still don't know exactly what's going to come at us. We've got to use the best available science. It has to be based on hydrology. It has to be focused based on hydrology. It has to address the supply and demand imbalance. And right off the bat, I think the lower basins' recognition of the structural deficit, their commitment to reduce uses by 1.5 in most circumstances, that is huge, absolutely huge. And you know, that's an element of our a common element, I guess, of both proposals. We feel it's imperative, whether it's explicit in the alternative or implicit in how it's the rationale behind it, it's imperative that there be recognition of the supply or the hydrologic shortages that the upper basin users face every single year. Even in years of lower basin surplus, there are upper basin users that are being shorted on certain tributaries. And we want to avoid anything that might, where the behavior of water users might affect the operation of the reservoirs. That was something that came to pass under the 2007 guidelines. So just to describe give a general description of the alternative. Really, the alternative is quite simple, and there's a lot of similarities to the lower basin, but there's also some really big differences. The alternative is really defined by two curves. The first one is a Powell release curve. And in our case, the upper division states, our alternative is based on the releases out of Powell will be determined based on the content in Lake Powell only. We're not going to look at the other reservoirs. We feel that's a sufficient and a good indicator of the health of the system. And we tried not to, in the spirit of trying to build back storage in the reservoirs, we start the maximum releases, except for in dam safety operations or flood control operations. The maximum that we suggest should be released out of there is 9 million acre feet per year. And as the reservoir drops, we reduce the amount of releases out of Lake Powell, such that when we're approximately 20 feet above the penstocks where we might have physical limitations on being able to move water through the reservoir, at that point we've reduced releases to 6 million acre feet. That's our curve. It's just a very simple curve with a couple of inflection points. And that 6 million may not be sufficient. It may be that in certain hydrologies, even that's not going to stabilize the system, at which point I think it will fall on the Secretary of Interior, on the Commissioner of Reclamation, to make a decision to release even less than that. But that's our release curve. The second curve is the curve that guides reductions in use. And those reductions are based, in our alternative, those reductions are based on the combined content of Lake Powell and Lake Mead only. Those are the two largest reservoirs in the nation, far larger than anything else on the system. And they are we feel they are adequate and very good indicators of the health of the system overall. We don't think that we gain much at all by looking at the other reservoirs that the lower basin proposal looks at. They've included the content of 7 reservoirs. We've done some modeling that shows the content of the remaining 5. That stays pretty constant. That doesn't really tell you much about the health of the system. It's the 2 big reservoirs that guide that are most indicative of the health of that system. I'm assuming most of you, being at a conference like this, have looked at the proposals, so you know what those curves look like generally. And you know that they're similar in the way they look. We began, I think John is the first person that I think it was you, and maybe not, but somebody called it the Z curve because of the shape of the curve. You know, it's as the on the y-axis, if you have the content of the combined content of those 2 reservoirs, you know at 100%, when the reservoirs are full or near full, there's no limitations on there's no need for anybody to take any reductions. In our instance, we start the reductions higher. So that Z curve, the shape of that curve, is common to both proposals, but there's differences, and I'll talk about some of those differences in a bit. In our proposal, we start the reductions when the content of the combined content of Mead and Powell reach 90%. We start, and quickly, by the time it gets down to 70%, we are at that static portion of that Z curve where the lower basin has committed to cut 1.5 million acre feet of use. And that remains all the way down to, I believe it's 20% content. At that point, it increases pretty dramatically on another ramp, that bottom ramp, all the way up to 3.9 million acre feet of cuts. Now, the similarities. The similarities are the shape of that curve, the fact that both curves build on that 1.5 million acre foot static, the element that addresses the structural deficit. But the shape, while the shape of the curve might be the same, the differences are, well, the inflection points, the starting points, the percentages are different. As I said, ours, the reductions start earlier with the intent of building storage and conserving storage as much as possible. Our approach looks at the content of 2 reservoirs, whereas the lower basin looks at the content of 7 reservoirs. And I've already talked a bit about why we think it's appropriate to just look at the 2. We think that is an adequate indicator of the health of the system. And there's no appreciable difference in it. And looking at all 7 raises some other issues that are of concern to us. Now, another really, perhaps the most stark difference between the 2 proposals is that on that bottom ramp, that lower ramp, what we have said is that those reductions should be taken by the lower basin. And we'll do some other things, and I'll explain why in a minute. So that's the element, that's the essence of our alternative that we think should be analyzed in the EIS. We do allow for conservation accounts in both reservoirs and Mead for the lower basin and Powell for the upper basin. But the thing that we say that we will do as part of this proposal is we term it parallel activities, and we called it that because we think it's kind of outside of the scope of the EIS itself. There's 2 specific categories of activities that we think that we can and will participate in. First, voluntary conservation programs, under which the conserved water from the upper basin would be stored in an account that will accrue over time. And because of the nature of the hydrology that we face, and the fact that we don't have big reservoirs, we're kind of constrained as to when we can do that. We can conserve water when there's water available. That's when we can conserve the most efficiently, and set it aside.
Yeah.
You wanted me to hurry?
A little bit, if you could. That would be great.
You take whatever time you need.
I do have some questions that you're like diving into. So maybe finish this point, and then we'll go to John, and then, because we only have 15 minutes.
Gotcha. 10 more minutes.
Okay.
So the second parallel activity is releases and, importantly, recovery from the upper initial units. That is Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, and Navajo reservoirs, as was done in 21 and 22, I believe. We've got experience in that. And we think that that's the sort of, those sorts of releases can and should be done in the event of an emergency, not on regular day-to-day operations. So just one final set of points that I want to make. I said I would explain why we think that the lower basin should take the cuts. The reason is this. The lower basin, we have really different starting points. The lower basin today, because of the structural deficit and other things, they're using more than the compact apportionment. The upper basin is using considerably less than our compact apportionment. Dealing with a structural deficit, they will essentially come to that compact apportionment, and will still be considerably below. Second, the upper basin, as I mentioned earlier, every year we face hydrologic shortages, because the water is not available to our users. And it's water that has been proven up. It's been put to use historically. It's not just water that's, for example, that was apportioned to us under the compact. It's water that has been put to use. We've quantified that. It's on the order of 1.3 million acre feet per year average. The numbers that we've looked at range from about 600,000 to over 2 million in any given year. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. That's great. I do have a follow-up question for that, and then we'll go to you, John.
Okay.
You have one more moment of almost relaxation. So in the upper basin proposal, you're outlining these cuts in the lower basin, and the upper basin, because of the shortages that happen here, has taken a stance against the mandatory cuts in the upper basin. Is that stance something that is a politically feasible position, considering, just literally feasible? Is it a politically feasible position to continue that stance, considering the political powers in the lower basin, the cuts that are being described in the lower basin?
I'm gonna take a stab at this. But I think the others should weigh in on this as well. And I'm gonna flip it a little bit. I think it's kind of politically and perhaps legally not tenable that we try and dictate mandatory cuts, because in our respective state, I think in every case it's probably in the Constitution, we're not able to simply mandate cuts to our water users. That is contrary to each of our constitutions. The only instance in which we could is if we are not in compact compliance. So doing it in advance of that is politically untenable in New Mexico. And I'll stop there and ask my upper basin colleagues to add to it.
There's not one thing on this river that's political.
shortages.
We recognize that that's a challenge. We also recognize that science will continue to help us, but we also deal with the reality that Esteban talked about. We don't have the ability to shut water users off unless there's a reason to do so. And particularly in Utah, the majority of the water that is available is pre-compact water. Even last year, with a huge amount of snowpack that we had, the state engineer in Utah cut people off because they were out of priority on a year when we had in Utah an average of 300% of snowpack. And I think that's got to be part of the understanding as we go into this. No doubt about it. As we've talked, we all have to figure out how to live with less water. That's something we have to do. How we do that is part of the challenge.
Okay. I think we, did you?
Yeah, can I,
Sure.
can I get in there too? Brandon told me I could say this. But I want to do, and Esteban took the liberty of correcting your question, so I'm going to correct this one also. I think we did not dictate how cuts were made in the lower basin. We took that curve from a curve that was previously used in our discussions. And so we did not feel like it was our responsibility to dictate where cuts happen in the lower basin, and felt like it's important to acknowledge that those hydrologic shortages are a lot of the cut. Doesn't mean that we won't live with less. We know we're going to have to. We have examples within our states already of us trying to build resilient water futures. Folks on the ground making those decisions that are hard, that are difficult, that are innovative, that are putting both state dollars, federal dollars to the test and saying, we know we have to live with less. We absolutely know that because we do constantly. And we don't have the reservoirs to predict what will happen. I think Commissioner Tootin talked about the snowpack and the snowpack being one of the largest reservoirs. I can't tell you what next year or the year following that snowpack is going to be exactly, and what hits are going to happen on the ground. I see some of my water users here, and I have to honor what they have to do all the time. They don't know what that snowpack is going to be. It doesn't mean that we're not willing, doesn't mean that we're not doing already. But we cannot promise something that we cannot deliver. That's not what's best. But what I've heard consistently within my state, within Colorado, is that if we are going to conserve, we want to make sure that it's not so others are not conserving. And so how do we build that into what we're doing? How do we build what the trust building exercise, let's say, of what we do means something? And I think that's been what's incredibly important in the Upper Basin.
I want to give, Lower Basin a chance to respond if you'd like, and I also definitely want to, John, if you could take a moment to just describe maybe at a high level how the system deficit fits in, how the tiered reductions fit in.
Sure. Well, coming from the state with 1.8% of the legal entitlements, I feel well qualified to do the most with the least amount of time. Just real quick on the Lower Basin proposal. We proposed the 7 reservoir trigger. And the only thing you look at the total system contents of the 7 reservoirs for is for when the Lower Basin shortages are triggered, right? Onto the first ramp, then onto the static ramp. It has nothing to do with the operation of those upstream units. It has nothing to do with the records of decision for how those reservoirs are operated. It goes to, Esteban made the point that they were interested in something that avoided manipulation, right? Under the 07 guidelines, both real, i.e. sweet spot, for those of you who are well-versed, and perceived. I mean, we had Don Osler thinking we were manipulating, Lake Mojave, when we're doing razorback, sucker spawning so that we could get more water out of Lake Mead. And the 7 reservoir trigger takes all that off the table because it doesn't matter where the water's parked. You want plenty of water in Blue Mesa on Labor Day, then the 7 reservoir solution is better than the 2 reservoir solution. So as just an agnostic, if you were landing from Mars looking at how do you decide how much less the lower basin uses, we thought the 7 reservoir solution was a sound proxy for how to do that. Second, Meade-Powell releases. We tried in good faith to address the hydrologic shortage concern in the upper basin by looking at the 3-year average of what the upper basin has actually used. And if they're using less, that's obviously because of bad hydrology, and you would release less from Powell to Meade when it's lower. And if they're using more, that means the river's healthier, and Powell should be able to release more to Meade. Turn into the 1.5. If we successfully implement the 1.5, first of all, the structural deficit is 1.3. So there's an extra 200,000 acre feet built into that to address climate change and rebuilding reservoir capacity. If the 1.5 is successfully implemented, Arizona will take 760,000 acre feet less, California will take 440,000 acre feet less, Nevada will take 50,000 acre feet less. All 7 states will be using less than their compact entitlements. So this idea that the upper basin is being asked to sacrifice so that the lower basin can use more than our compact entitlements is belied by the math that is within the lower basin proposal. We believe that once the 1.5 is implemented, once we have solved the structural deficit, once we have made the first down payment of 200,000 acre feet on climate change and adaptation to a warmer, drier future, that after that, when all 7 states are using less than their compact entitlements, that adapting to anything bigger than the 1.5 in reductions becomes a 7-state and 2-country obligation to get this river into equilibrium.
For that. That was fast. Do you all have anything?
Yeah, in brief, I think everyone who uses water can use less. Certainly the case in California, and despite the fact that 20 years ago, California, for all practical purposes, permanently committed to reducing its use by 800,000 acre feet a year, and now stepping up with an additional 440,000 acre feet a year in 20-some year time, over 1.2 million acre foot a year permanent reduction. It's a big deal. And we do this with one particular irrigation district, modest one in Southern California, committing to 500,000 acre feet a year of conservation, a modest urban water agency in Southern California that, despite having half the population of the Colorado River Basin, also depending on the Colorado River, depends on another supply of water that sometimes only gets 5% allocation, sometimes 0. So despite all those things and internal difficulties all of us have within our own states, Tom has a whole county that's been cut off of water. Climate change is going to require us all to do more. So everyone who uses water can certainly use less. I'm reminded of that every time I see a center median, which here in Boulder are very green and very lush.
I'll talk to somebody about that.
There's a lot of non-functional turf in Boulder.
Let me talk about my legislation.
So just to pile on, I guess, by the end of 2023, the lower basin can serve more than 1 million acre feet of water. As a result of all of that, we only put 5.8 million acre feet to consumptive use, the lowest consumptive use since 1984. So, I mean, those numbers also are very indicative of what we're doing in the lower basin.
Okay. So I think shortage and how the cuts would be made are 2 areas where I have heard maybe disagreements or sticking points for you all. We've talked a little bit about shortage, about the reservoirs and the definition of the total system storage, including 7 reservoirs. I'm continuing to hear in the Upper Basin that idea isn't that popular. I don't know how you guys come together on that issue. You've made your case for it when you described your proposal, but what is a way forward for anyone who'd like to take that one?
We have a lot of work ahead of us, and we're looking forward to doing that. I think we're open to all of the ugly conversations that need to be had. Sometimes it's not enjoyable to have those in a room like this with folks watching, but we're open to having conversations, and I think we've described what the issues are with the 7 reservoirs. It's not their intention wasn't to be looked at as a supply. There are records of decision that are associated with those. There are tribes that are directly impacted in the Upper Basin because of that, and so we can have the conversations. We're going to continue to have our viewpoints and our positions, and we're going to be focused on trying to move the needle for the future.
And just to clarify, maybe even just for me, thank you everyone for listening. When we're talking about the hydrologic shortages and the cutbacks that happen in the Upper Basin, would that amount of water figure into the amount of water the Lower Basin is asking the Upper Basin to cut back? Does that?
I believe that at some point we'll have to have discussion on that. That is not determined at this point.
And I think there's flexibility in the Lower Basin as to how and when the Upper Basin contributes.
Okay.
Right? We just don't want that answer to be zero, never. Once we get past zero, never, now we're having a conversation.
Okay. I have a million other questions on my list. We're at time, but I want to ask one other one. The recent water settlement between the Navajo, Hopi, San Juan, Paiute, and Arizona would give a port. This is for Tom over there.
Brandon was going to answer, but he deferred.
Oh, yeah.
Tom might get sick too, but.
Well, Tom, so it would give a portion of Arizona's water that is the Upper Basin portion to 2 tribes and allow them to use that water in the Lower Basin. So I was wondering, Tom, could you just explain, I mean, this is like a huge settlement. It marks a shift in how tribal water rights are working, could increase certainty in the basin, I have heard. And so I'm just wondering if you could describe the settlement in a little more detail and just really elaborate on what got us to this point.
Sure, I'll try to be quick given the time, but as you said, it's the Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe, and the San Juan Southern Paiute, plus approximately 37 or so other parties within the state of Arizona, including the state itself and some state agencies. This has been going on in fits and starts for 40 years. I've only been involved for about 11, but it's a very long time coming. So Arizona has 2.8 million acre feet of lower basin water, 50,000 acre feet of upper basin water. The Navajo Nation would get 44,700 acre feet of upper basin water that it could use anywhere on its lands in either the upper or the lower basin. The Hopi would get 2,300 acre feet of water, and the Navajos are committing to deliver to San Juan Southern Paiute 300 acre feet per year. That upper basin water could also be marketed by the Navajo and the Hopi anywhere in the state of Arizona in either the upper or the lower basin. That follows on with other tribal settlements we've had in which they're able to market their water within certain parts of the state of Arizona, and the recent Colorado Indian tribes marketing legislation and agreements that we just signed recently. There's some lower basin water involved as well, 3,500 acre feet of water. That's the same priority as CAP for the Navajo Nation, and 5,928 acre feet for the Hopi. The Hopi are giving 100 acre feet of that water to the Navajo Nation as well. That water could also be used in the upper basin. So that water could be transferred and used by the Navajo Nation in the upper basin part of the reservation as well. Of course, that water could, the difficulty of the accounting, all that needs yet to be worked out. One really important piece of this settlement now, as compared to over the last few decades, we had something called non-Indian agricultural priority water. It's our lowest priority Colorado River water, essentially. It was used to settle tribal claims under the Water Settlement Act that I helped negotiate starting in 1999. We thought the priority of that, or the reliability of that, had some issues with it, but based on the numbers we negotiated in the lower basin proposal, 760,000 acre feet, that water's gone. 600,000 acre feet, reductions to Arizona makes that water gone. A lot of that is the Gila River community and other non-tribal folks. It was a tough discussion with the Navajo and Hopi to say that that water's off the table. But we did it because that water is totally unreliable. It's not there. And to some degree, for me, a recognition of what we've been talking about, that there's not as much water in this system anymore. And we can't have a very low reliable or water supply that's not going to be there, be part of a tribal water rights settlement. There's some other important provisions. The San Juan Southern Paiute Reservation gets delineated by Congress. And then perhaps there's a number that might appear startling to some, $5 billion worth of funding in the proposed settlement for infrastructure projects so that the water can be put to use, agricultural efficiencies, a whole bunch of other uses, including the two tribes, Navajo and Hopi, could go within Arizona and potentially use some of that money to buy water rights that might be open for sale on the market. So a lot of creativity moving forward, and it does settle all the claims of the Navajo and Hopi, both within our state and to the Colorado River. So this is a huge step forward. Hopefully we'll get support from everyone in this room and all the states in Congress. When this daylights in Congress, I can't tell you exactly when that's going to happen. But again, we did this last phase in record time. I think it started about last November. We see windows of opportunity, I think, right now with this administration and for other reasons. So a very proactive, very huge step forward, and it will only leave Arizona with a handful of tribes that don't have their rights either quantified or settled. So there's a lot of certainty for us in that regard as well.
Okay. Thank you for that. I think we're going to transition into audience questions. And Celine, what have we got going over there?
Well, I have to say, we have a really fun, lively discussion going on through the slide. You all are amazing, and you're going to have to bear with me because I can't ask 52 questions. I'll do some grouping. We'll have some fun. And I want to start by sharing a few of the questions that I'm not actually going to ask you and provide some context. So we heard this morning about the miscalculation about water supply availability that we've had throughout decision-making in the 20th and 21st century. And that, I think, is bringing us to questions like, and I'll read this one because it's our second it's the top question with the voting right now. Will Colorado acknowledge there is insufficient water in the system to make full use of their river allocation and commit to stopping their Colorado River development? Becky, you can answer that if you want to, but I'm not really going to ask it. There's also questions like, what will it take for the lower basin to reduce use to the level of the upper basin? What about looking at hydrology for all of the states when you take into consideration supply? And how do you justify asking the upper basin to use less? I think that gives you a sense of where your audience is in this discussion. So I'm going to ask a question that's a little bit lower down in the list, but I think gets at something we haven't talked about today. Are you considering basin-wide programs? It says demand management. I'm going to say voluntary compensated water conservation programs. And if so, what are the barriers and is there funding for it?
Was that directed to the upper basin or?
That is for everyone.
Everyone, okay,
Yeah.
great. I think we acknowledged in our proposal that there's going to need to be conserved, consumptive use conservation, regardless of what you call it. I don't even want to limit it to just one type of conservation. I think we know that conservation is going to need to happen. We've never said that is not needed. And we've never not done that in the upper basin. Or in the lower basin. I got leader of conservation sitting next to me, or leader of inappropriate ads on about conservation, one or the other.
Effective.
Effective ads.
Effective. I mean, it's not a musical like some of the other folks in the room have, but we've always agreed that we have to live within the means of the river. We agree to it because we do it, and we have to create a more resilient future for everyone.
I'll jump in as well. There's a lot of pilot discussion or exploring conservation programs, just to give some context, and the California example that I think could be a helpful blueprint to sort of moving paradigms forward. In California, last year in October 2023 marked the 20-year anniversary of the Quantification Settlement Agreement, 800,000 acre-feet a year effort to reduce use overnight. As part of that, we've got a number of agreements and arrangements between individual agencies. Just to name them off and hopefully don't miss any of them, as part of this whole suite of efforts, we have the Fort Yuma-Quezon Indian Tribe and Metropolitan, another one Coachella and IID, another one IID in San Diego, another one IID in Metropolitan, another one with the Palo Verde Irrigation District and Metropolitan, another with Metropolitan and the Barred Water District. So these are all robust programs that have either been added onto over time, been around for the last 20 years, or even predated that. So I think that would be very helpful, basin-wide, is to get more recognition that these sort of partnerships are possible, and get this to be more standard throughout the basin and not so controversial. Certainly it's very controversial when you're exploring, you're thinking about it, and before you ink the signature, or just after you ink it, or maybe in the case of California, you spend 10 years litigating whether that signature is valid. But once you get over that hump and actually start implementing these programs, opportunities emerge, and in many of these cases, you have folks who really enjoy these programs, want to augment these programs, rejigger these programs. So I think that there's a lot of great examples in California that have become standardized over the last 20 years, and we'd be happy to share that blueprint with our other 6 Basin State friends and 2 in Mexico.
So I'll just add again, an annual number for 2023. Our drought contingency plan contributions, which was basically a cut, 192,000 acre-feet. Shortage reductions and DCP contribution in total, 512,000 acre-feet. Yet with that 512,000 acre-foot cut, we still had water users come forth, tribes, cities, industry, et cetera, to put another 592,000 acre-feet on the table on the compensated conservation program. I'd love to see that move forward out into the future, but I see it's going to be a combination of cuts in these conservation programs where we can find the funding. And if the cuts get too deep, people who put the water on the table voluntarily won't have the water to put on the table. So it's a zero-sum game. But I think absolutely there's a role moving forward for those programs.
Shannon, I might just jump in, and I think everyone's aware, but I want to just make sure that people understand the complexity of these kinds of programs, particularly in the upper basin, because last year with SCPP, we were able to enter agreements with a number of entities, individuals for the most part, and were able to reduce use by about 30,000 acre-feet. Well, 30,000 out of 11, 12, 13 million reservoir or river isn't a lot. But the point is that was done, and it gave us an expectation of what we might be able to do. This year, we've actually doubled that number, about 120 participants, and yet at the same time, it takes a tremendous amount of effort to save a quantity of water that's not, relatively speaking, all that huge. But what it's done is it's helped us understand what capacity or what capability we might have in the upper basin. It's not like we can contract with one individual for tens of thousands of acre-feet. Maybe hundreds of acre-feet, 1,000 acre-foot reduction for some folks is basically their farm that year. And so I think we need to be realistic that there is no doubt we are and will continue to be involved in these conservation programs. But what's the real expectation of what we can get out of them? I think that's part of what we really need to understand and recognize that there isn't a silver bullet to water conservation activities.
No one wants to talk about cutting the lower basin to the upper basin or whether Colorado.
Share one sort of piece of context on that. We have one county in California, LA County, which has more population than all 4 upper basin states. So trying to get also the rest of California, Arizona, and Nevada to get down to the same amount of use is not practical. Just put it that way.
Great, we can move on. So I would say there are a ton of questions about the role of tribal nations in the basin, and I want to provide a little bit of context and a little bit of gratitude to this group for your work on this. I think we are all well aware that it has been a year of really rapid change since we were together last year, and I'm thinking about the initiation of the federal state tribal dialogue that we heard about this morning and the MOU that was signed in the upper basin with the tribal nations. We've also seen an increase in Indigenous leadership on your state boards, and we have seen changes in how you are all communicating with tribal nations within your states. So within that context, there are a lot of questions about formal seats at the negotiating table. And so they're phrased a few different ways, and I'll try to combine them into one. Are the states willing to go beyond what we have done now to involve tribal nations directly and as equal partners to negotiate the next set of guidelines?
I'll jump in because I think this is really a reclamation thing. We up here are looked at when we get put on these panels for whatever reason as the 7 people to determine the future of the river. Really not. We have the same seat at the table at this much larger table that the Department of Interior set up. That's 7 of us, but there's also 30 others. And then you've got the federal government running the NEPA process, which considers everybody equally, whether you're a state representative, an irrigation district, a tribe, urban water agency, a member of the public, everybody's comments get evaluated equally. And ultimately, that's a reclamation interior decision about how that goes. Certainly, I think, as you've mentioned, there's much more tribal engagement. In our case in California, we've had our first tribal representative ever on the Colorado River Board, President Joaquin, who's in the back there, if he wave his hand around there. But certainly not all states are equal. We have one tribe that's located really entirely all in our state. We also have our friends at the Colorado River Indian Tribe that we interact with as well, but certainly things are different. And Tom has, well, I don't know how many, what was your number?
We have 22 federally recognized tribes. In our Arizona Reconsultation Committee public process, we now have 5 tribal members. When we had that process, and it was called the steering committee then, that we used to deliver the drought contingency plan in 2019, we had 3, so we're expanding there. We're also relying on the 38 sovereigns process. And indicative of my governor, Governor Hobbs' commitment to the tribes, about a month ago, I hired a full-time tribal liaison. For those tribes who haven't been contacted yet, he is going to be reaching out to each tribe, and he and I are going to do meetings with every tribe, going to their place to talk to them. So we have different layers here, and not equating tribe sovereignty to lots of different layers, but the top layer for me is what Camille talked about earlier, the commissioner saying, I talk to these folks on a regular basis, and then it's me and the 2 people from the lower basin sitting together, and then these people, and then the water users. And it's these concentric circles. There's not a table. There never has been. There's opportunity for everyone to participate in a very meaningful way.
Can I respond
Yeah.
on this? I think it's no secret that tribal engagement's been a priority of mine since appointed in the role as a commissioner. And so the MOU was a step towards that as the upper basin. My priority and focus is obviously going to be on the 2 Ute tribes that are within Colorado. the Southern Ute, and the Ute Mountain Ute. I may be in a little bit of an easier situation than Tom because both of those tribes have settled water rights. That is a benefit that they are settled. However, there's still much of that is undeveloped. And that is the part that I have to be focused on as I look and represent and stand with those tribes specifically as Colorado's representative. And so there is work to do with that. Currently, they're not able to access their undeveloped tribal water. And there's things that are burdening and are in the way, one of them being a first use issue. And we're going to continue to push and push and push on that so that their settled rights can be acknowledged. And so we all have a responsibility. Tom has an incredibly difficult job. My priority is to focus on the Ute Mountain Ute and the Southern Ute and the Upper Basin tribes and acknowledge that federal government is that federal trustee and in all of these cases, and our responsibility is to stand with.
May I weigh in just a little bit? When we had the signing ceremony for the MOU in Chama, what was it, a month ago or thereabouts, a bit more? I think it was Lorelei Cloud that very directly asked us if we were open to more robust participation. She was probably more direct than that. You know, I think she said, "Can we get a seat at the table?" or something to that effect. And the answer that I think each of us gave was some variation of the following: we're all open to continuing to work and increase the participation of them, but it's not a simple task. You know, we're working within the context of the compacts that are federal legislation, state legislation. Opening up any one of those things, even for you know, how you, for example, a commission operates, is, you know, it's fraught with difficulties. And so anyway, we absolutely have to find better ways of engaging. We're just starting on this path. We're open to it. We have to. The tribes control and have a lot of water that they have been making available to make solutions possible. In some instances, they're not able to get their own water, as Becky has said, and we also have a responsibility to them to help them get some of that water. Again, recognizing we're not going to be the primary decision makers, but we need to move in that direction.
Shannon, I just want to add that I'm very, very thrilled that each of the Upper Division states and each of the Upper Division tribes have signed the MOU. When we started this process a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, we didn't know where it was going to go. We didn't know how many sessions we would have. We didn't know what the end result would be. Are we there to where we need to be? Absolutely not. But have we made a lot of progress? I would say absolutely. And so I'm thrilled to let everyone know that all of the Upper Division tribes and states signed the MOU and look forward to continued cooperation and communication.
Thanks.
All right. So I'm going to turn us to the questions in here about the river as a living river, what we're doing to protect and restore ecosystems within the decisions that you all are making. So can you share with us how you're thinking about your responsibilities to make sure that the decisions about the guidelines are going to protect and restore ecosystems at the same time?
I'll jump in first here. So there's the Multi-Species Conservation Program, which has been an effective program run for a number of years here. California has taken an eager effort to try and expand that program in advance of post-2026. We're evaluating an opportunity in the southern Palo Verde Valley. It's a several thousand acre site that we'd like to establish some deep water habitat in for a number of the endangered species that are covered within that. So that's an exciting opportunity. Our Wildlife Conservation Board in California just approved, I think, $10 million or something to cover part of that acquisition in addition to the other contributions with the MSCP parties. So I think that's a really big, important component here, trying to move forward and actually build habitat that birds and Mexican garter snakes and bats and the other critters that hang out in the lower Colorado River can enjoy. Salton sea is also critically important in California. 400 plus varieties of birds and other species migrate through the Salton Sea and enjoy it. We have some other critical, interesting issues with some other endangered species that exist at the Salton Sea. So there's a commitment equally to conservation, both of water and species that enjoy this region.
Does anyone want to add?
So I'll just add, and without getting into too many specific projects, the commissioner was just in Yuma for funding for a wetland there. But more importantly, from my view, our proposal, the way it protects Lake Powell and allows for the releases from Powell to Mead, protects the Grand Canyon. In 2021, the spring, there were projections of Deadpool at Lake Powell, right? And when I got on media interviews and said that means potentially no water through the Grand Canyon, there were not a lot of happy people in the state of Arizona when I was saying that. Nevertheless, that was projected if you go to Deadpool. The reduction of our use in the lower basin, and by virtue of that, you're gonna have less water flowing out of Lake Mead, and we're gonna have to do programs to address those impacts. But overall, I think the proposal on its face gives that environmental protection that I think you're asking about.
I would just add that there's a whole lot more flexibility for environmental projects, environmental issues, if there's more storage in the reservoirs. And I think both of the proposals include more storage in the reservoirs. And so not that we would ever determine how that water is used to benefit the ecosystem, but having more water to use obviously is a huge benefit.
Anyone else?
I'll just, when I agree with kind of what Tom's premise. I think that kind of, what we're doing here is gonna undergird our ability to sustain water for water users, for the environment, for everything. But part of the question, I think, had to do with process. How are we trying to assure that these proposals adequately address those things? Well, that's part of the EIS. The EIS itself it's going to analyze each one of these proposals and assess how they do relative to one another. And then, there's obviously some decision making that has to happen after that. But the process itself is designed to help assure that that we're looking at those sorts of things.
I agree with much of what was said. And again, the best thing that we can do for the environment is first and foremost to live within the means of the river. And I think everyone up here has committed to that. And I think one of the ways that we do that is move from a demand-based operations to a supply-based operations. And that's one of the better things that we can do.
All right, I've been told I can ask one more question, and this one is interesting and very high on our list, so I'll end with it. Are alfalfa export restrictions on the table to stop the exportation of Colorado River water?
So we export a lot of things with water in them. There's chips being made in Arizona. So the Boulder chips you saw outside in the hallway, the potato chips, those are also Arizona chips. But I'm talking about the other type of chip.
Equal opportunity. We're equal opportunity chip makers.
Yes. So there's chips, all kinds of other things. We make movies with water in California, and there's all kinds of stuff grown or made all over the basin. Alfalfa is one of them. really the amount that's actually exported is smaller than you'd think, and it's certainly a good headline. But we all eat, and I dare anyone here to, and we'll see what percentage maybe after lunch, who do not consume any sort of dairy product or any cheese or any beef or any of those things. So you can, anyone who's wanting to ride the anti-alfalfa bandwagon, don't consume any of those products at lunch. It starts at home.
Done.
Yeah, you can do it.
You cheat.
I want to say something, but I'm not going to.
That's the first time that's ever happened.
Are you sure? You can. We have time.
Just disconnect your mic.
Hold on.
We have 3 minutes. Let's do it, Becky.
No, I was just saying, we're not all powerful. Like, we don't have control of all public policy as much as people think we do. But I'd like to. I have some great ideas, but I mean, we're trying. That's it.
Okay. Well, I think we're done. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, panelists.
All right, thank you, Shannon, and thank you, panelists. Before you get up and leave, let me say a few things real quick. A few quick announcements, and I'll tell you about lunch. The 2 quick announcements, one's the good news, there's more coffee. The bad news is, if you were one of the people that had an issue with parking this morning, they're now telling you to move your car to 308, and you hopefully got an email explaining that, and if not, Annie should have the details, but there's something going on there. Okay, for the rest of you, it's lunch, which is on the 2nd floor right above us. So you just go up 1 flight of stairs out here. Again, there's not enough seating, so sit in the overflow rooms, go outside, do whatever you want, and have a good time.